Yo, hello. We are back again with another Arcane video guide. However, unlike all the other ones, we have Echo skills now, which is a brand new gimmick they added to the game with the surprisingly fitting Echoes banner. I did also want to talk about those, but I didn't necessarily want to separate them, and I figured since this is all encompassed in one banner, we may as well combine the entire thing into one video. So, we may as well get right into it. Arcane Caliburnus, hopefully I pronounced that correctly. It is a slaying tome that grants Spectrum 5, guaranteed follow-up attacks, special cooldown charge +1 per attack, aka breath, and low attack res. The tome in and of itself feels a lot more player phase oriented than a lot of the other weapons that we do have, although it does seem to work for all sorts of archetypes. Given the lax nature of the weapon, it isn't something like Devour where it's specifically wanted for faster units, although there are arguments to also use it on slower units. It's definitely more akin to the faster ones. This Arcane, like many other Arcanes, works for pretty much every single type of green tome unit, which is really nice if you're just looking for a green tome to give to any sort of favorite that you might have. It has low attack res, so your damage output is generally going to be consistent, and if you need to take hits whenever necessary, you have a much better chance at that. Because it has special cooldown charge per attack, it does open the way for a lot more specials that a lot of other units probably couldn't take advantage of with their own specific weapon. You have your standard slang, which means you can still be open up to times pulse instant special shenanigans, guaranteed follow-up so even your slower units can use this, and overall it's a pretty decent inheritable. Meanwhile, with the new Echo skills, aka X slots that we have in the game now, these are essentially the equivalent of Arcanes, but they're more so a secondary sacred seal. That's how I'm gonna put it. Even though it doesn't function like a sacred seal, it's essentially a 5th skill option that you can have if you fodder that specific skill from any sort of attuned unit. And they more or less work the same way as Arcanes do. You inherit it to any sort of unit. You don't lose the unit. You can dupe any sort of skill that you give to any of the attuned. You can't use the 5th slot on any sort of unit that has a PRF skill, otherwise they won't be able to use said skill, but you can still use their PRF weapons. It's, again, more or less just going to be the same thing here. Also worth mentioning that if you are going to give this to any sort of Arcane unit, then they also can't use whatever PRF skill they have. They can use the Arcanes though, since that isn't a PRF skill, it is a weapon. Very self-explanatory. We have Death Blow 2 and Attack Speed Oath, or rather Attack Oath Echo. It's more or less the same thing as the tier 4 version, except you don't get the in-combat stats. Meanwhile, with Death Blow, it's Death Blow 2. Very self-explanatory, very simplistic, and arguably pretty good. In any case, I'll be going over good users of that relatively soon, but for now I do want to get into the builds, starting with the infantry units, which in my opinion definitely have the most flexibility when it comes to any sort of builds, although I think that's more so due to the archetype being infantry than anything else. Being an infantry definitely benefits because they have access to a lot of skills such as Times Pulse and Oath. Even though Times Pulse isn't necessarily on the screen right now, I think one of the more interesting builds that you could get away with at this time is something with Flare and Speed Preempt. The idea is that you would want to set up Speed Smoke first so that in a scenario where you do have the enemy phase or can act as a mixed phase unit, you can at least shrug off a bit of damage. Granted, it would be a lot better if you had it out of the gate ready, so you don't necessarily have to set up with Speed Smoke 4. You could use this with somebody like Flame or any sort of unit that grants damage reduction to your unit, but if you want it to be a bit more self-sufficient, you have the idea right here. You initiate combat and set up Speed Smoke. That also helps with your preempt checks. Preempt into Flare and attack speed finish so that you can not only keep a consistent amount of health, but because it also has breath in the weapon, if you so happen to miss the kill, then you could always get a second Flare going off if you are able to double. It will require an initial combat because that's how most smokes do work, but if you do want to cut that out of the equation, I would recommend just running some sort of support that grants damage reduction. Otherwise, it's a lot more self-sufficient. Otherwise, you could go with some sort of player phase heavy builds, whether that's with Magical No Follow and Remote Sparrow with Aether, or some sort of desperation build, so you don't have to worry about getting countered whatsoever. Because the weapon does have breath built into it, you could always go down the route of Aether because you'll always get it off on the second hit, assuming the foe does counter. And if the foe is able to counter, then having Remote Sparrow around is always going to be convenient because you do want to reduce as much damage as possible so that you can at least get 2 attacks out. And with Magical No Follow, you'll at least be securing more damage output if the foe has some sort of damage reduction properties. Other than that, it's just continually stacking up attack and speed as much as possible. The same thing can be said about the third build too, although it could be a bit more flexible because it does have a guaranteed guaranteed follow-up. You don't necessarily have to run this on a fast unit, in my opinion, because the guaranteed follow-up with Desperation means that you'll still get 2 attacks out before the foe can counter. But just keep in mind that if any foe has some sort of follow-up denial stuff or full no follow-up present, then it's not going to work whatsoever. But with the likes of Finish and attack speed Oath is especially important because you do get the condition met if you are moving more than 2 tiles before initiating combat. And then with the likes of Flare and Blade Session, you'll just be doing a good amount of damage. Otherwise, you can pretty much just lift Arcane Sonya's build right off her. You could grab Escape Route 4 Ploy if you really want it, although it just depends on the unit if they have the res. Otherwise, you could go Times Pulse 4 with a 2 cooldown special, so that way you can always initiate combat with an instant special. And with Fury 3 in the Sacred Seal slot, you can always cancel one after combat, which is incredibly nice for hit and run strategies. Otherwise, you could also just do an AoE set. This one will require either at first combat or some external support because you aren't able to get your own charges immediately out of the gate, which is one of the benefits with the red tome. Although in my opinion, when it comes to AoE spam, the blue tome is definitely the best one because of the true damage tacked onto it. But the benefit to running an AoE set on the green tome is that it does have breath built into it, which is something I keep listing for all these builds, but it means you don't get gimped by guard effects unless they have tempo as well, which is also really convenient for just looping specials. Otherwise, you could continually do stat ball stuff. Maybe you could do like a half sweep effect thing with the guaranteed follow-up. If you are fast enough, you can cancel out the guaranteed follow-up with wind sweep and make a regular speed check and prevent any sort of counterattack depending on which sweep skill you are using. Granted, you will need the speed for it, but I don't think it's going to be a big problem for some units over others. And other than that, you could just spam specials with Spiral 4 and Times Pulse 4. You could easily charge a special whenever needed, give it to whatever specific unit you want depending on their stat type, give them a respective special, and continually spam 4 cooldown specials, and you'll be relatively good to go. Meanwhile, with the Cavalry and Flyer builds, they're more or less going to be the same, but I think there's something interesting that you can do with them, specifically with Flared Sparrow. And if you haven't already caught on to it, yes, the breath effect is very good. Leave a comment on how many times I say breath in this video because I guarantee you it's going to be in the dozens. Either way, with that effect in mind, Flared Sparrow and Escape Route 4, you could theoretically set up a Flared Sparrow very, very easily, assuming the foe doesn't have a guarantee follow, because that's going to be the biggest weakness when it comes to this tome, is that you don't have any sort of way of preventing any sort of guaranteed follow-up. You could charge up Miracle on the first attack, assuming you have at least 1 cooldown support from any sort of unit. It could be an Asker, it could be a Grand Scratcher, it could be anything. That'll put you at a 2 cooldown Miracle. With the Arcane, you initiate combat, it becomes instantly charged, and assuming the foe is only able to get 1 attack or they don't kill in the first hit, you can easily set up Flared Sparrow and run away with Kanto. And for the Flyer in particular, you could also run guidance support so you can make warping and movement shenanigans so much more effective. Otherwise, for your slower ones or just the ones that may not necessarily have some sort of guarantee follow-up or not really good damage reduction properties, you can run the combination of Remote and Brash Assault 4. Very tried and true combo just for getting damage out and surviving if needed. The slower ones and the faster ones always appreciate this no matter what, just because it's 50% plus damage reduction if you have both combined. And assuming the foe has follow-up prevention, you could cancel it out with one of the guaranteed follow-ups in the weapon or the B slot and still double through, especially if you're slower. And other than that, you could go again with Desperation 4, stack up as much attack and speed as possible. I think the Flyer probably does it a bit better in this regard, not necessarily because the Cav can't trigger Desperation 4 as easily, but because they have attack speed unity capabilities, which is something the Cavs can't easily take advantage of just because of their archetype. You can still use it in all regards, but you will also just not have the same movement flexibility as the Flyers do. Just stack up attack and speed as much as possible and you'll be good to go. And lastly, we have the armor builds, and to be quite honest, running ranged armors is not really the best. A lot of the melee armors also don't really do great nowadays because of the Hinoka stuff, but if you're just looking for an armor and you want to give it to an armor, you still have plenty of options. You could continually speed stack on 2 of the ones that we do have, which are not bad by any means. You could go Savvy 4 with the Arcane, so not only are you securing your own guaranteed follow-up, but you're also getting damage reduction. And with the added benefit of breath built into these weapons, you could instantly retaliate with an armored beacon or armored flow. That's always very, very nice if you're just looking for damage output as well. Otherwise, you could run Kestrel Stance for guard effects, or you could run Guard 4 in the B slot if you just want to have some sort of protection there. You could also run Special Fighter 4, even though it does have overlap with the Arcane. You do get healing as a result, which I would absolutely recommend if you are looking for sustainability, but otherwise Guard 4 is good. If you're a bit worried about armor effective weaponry, you can run Savalan Shield. It does cut down a bit on the bulk, but otherwise they're not bad options by any means. And as far as builds are concerned, concerned, that's going to be about it. I'll get into the Echo skills real soon, but I quickly want to show you the list, in my opinion, that would absolutely benefit from this weapon the most. Obviously, you have all the generic ones, a lot of the units that may not also have a refine, or refines that are relatively outdated, you know, such as World of Thracia Olwen, Spring Sharena, Robin, Rajat, any of those. A lot of the seasonal ones that also don't have PRFs in general would absolutely benefit from this. The only ones, in my opinion, that are debatable are the dancers and the pseudo support units. The dancers don't necessarily benefit from the arcane whatsoever, but they aren't necessarily worse because of it. If you do want to give it to them, then it's not necessarily any skin off their back, but at the same time, you probably have a lot better options when it comes to combat units. Meanwhile, with Winter Bernadetta and Pent, they do offer decent support in their respective areas, but if you do want them to be a lot more combative, then I would absolutely recommend the Arcane. Otherwise, you could keep their PRFs if you just want to tether them to a bit more support. And as for all the other ones, they arguably just have weapons that are much better than the Arcane, or PRF skills that they would much rather keep. The only units I would recommend waiting for are Fallen Leon, Young Merrick, Summer Selena, and Triandra. All of these units should be getting refined within the scope of a year. I'm pretty sure Young Merrick is going to be one of the next ones that we do get, if not within a few months. Fallen Leon is middle of book 4 because of Fallen. Summer Selena is the same thing. And Triandra, if I remember correctly, should be getting remixed sooner or later. So it couldn't hurt just to hold off and wait, especially Triandra since she is a dancer. And as for the Echo skills, there are plenty of candidates you can absolutely give it to. But in my opinion, there are absolute standouts that you should give the Attack Oath Echo X slot to. Surprisingly, a fair amount of them do have PRF skills, but you can absolutely ditch it if you want to. The two most notable examples, in my opinion, are absolutely going to be Citrine and Summer Malchez. Tome of Luxury spreads all her visible buffs to every single unit within 2 spaces, which is incredible. So with Pledge in her C slot and Attack Oath Echo, she could give everybody guaranteed follow-up, warping, and breath per hit, on top of other potential support that you could give through other means such as infantry speed tactic or dull or any of that. I would argue Citrine is probably the best candidate of this skill. Meanwhile, you have Summer Malchez who could run Guidance and Canto and Attack Oath Echo, meaning that his warping capabilities is really good, but also he acts as a really solid frontliner because of the guidance support that he can give. I would argue that Attack Oath Echo definitely works best on guidance bots, outside of Citrine of course, just because they have the ability to Omni Warp. Meanwhile, you have Duo Thor, who's just an incredibly supportive unit. You don't necessarily need her C slot, even though it is relatively decent, but as it currently stands, guidance support is arguably much more valuable at this point. That was Sabotage 4 and her B slot and Attack Oath Echo. She could warp around, do the same thing that Shez was doing, and you'll pretty much just have a more supportive Summer Malchez. The only big difference is that she just can't frontline, but she has a lot more capabilities that he doesn't have, and vice versa. And Wind Claude, I know people might be questioning this one because Deep Star is incredibly good, but the idea here is more so just build flexibility more than anything else. You can run Guidance on him, C-Feud, any sort of build that you really want to run on him. He arguably doesn't even have to be attached to his B slot, even though it is an incredibly good skill. Having Preempt could also make him incredibly potent in the enemy phase too, especially if you haven't set up Deep Star. It's more so just so you can have all the cooldown for your lethality ready to go. His weapon grants 2, Attack Oath Echo grants it in the X slot, and you'll always have lethality charged for every single combat. And with C-Feud, you don't necessarily have to worry about Miracle in most scenarios. You could also run the Guidance Oath combo if you really want to. That's not bad whatsoever either. Other than that, you have Fallen Maria, who is an incredible support no matter what. It just allows her to teleport around whenever needed and give Miracle to selected allies. Very convenient, very simplistic stuff. And otherwise, it's pretty much just going to be any sort of flyer. Doesn't even have to be a ranged one. In my opinion, the guidance units that don't have access to other sorts of warp are going to be the best users of Attack Oath Echo, just because they have the ability to Omni Warp. So if you have any sort of flyer you want to give it to and they don't have a skill that you necessarily want to replace, I highly recommend giving it to any of those. And with Death Blow Echo, it's very self-explanatory. It's extra attack in the player phase. So really any sort of high value nuke or any nuke in particular just wants it. You could also give it to specific Gale Force units if you are afraid of missing kills. I think one of the closer examples comes to Edelgard, not the legendary one or the summer one, the OG one, because she has a Raging Storm built into her weapon. So you could always stack up her attack even more in the X slot, run Wings of Mercy 4, and become a relatively decent Gale Force unit. Otherwise, it's very simplistic. You just make your nukes hit harder, and it's pretty nice for the most part. I would argue this probably is going to have a lot more value than Attack Oath Echo, depending on what type of game modes you're playing, but overall, I would say they're both pretty solid. And that's really going to be about it for the video. If you are going to summon for any of these skills, let me know who you plan on giving it to, because I am curious. There is a lot of stuff you could do with a lot of these units and skills overall. And if you liked what you watched or saw or listened to or whatever you did, make sure to like and subscribe. And until next time, I'll see you later.